Before we start, have you ever been awake at 3 a.m., staring out into the dark, and felt something staring back? What if the night wasn't just empty, but waiting to take you somewhere? It was supposed to be a simple overnight trip back to the city. My car was in the shop, my wallet was light, and every bus had already left for the night. The empty streets stretched out in both directions, dark and desolate under the flickering glow of a single street lamp. I had been walking for hours, the chill of the early morning air biting at my skin. My watch read 2:56 a.m. when I spotted it. A sleek black train cutting across the horizon, gliding soundlessly along tracks that hadn't been there before. It stopped ahead of me, as if waiting. There was no station, no platform, just the train, its body gleaming like polished obsidian. The only sound was the faint hiss of steam escaping its sides. My first instinct was to turn around and keep walking, but something about it called to me. As I approached, I noticed the door to one of the cars slide open with a soft groan. Warm light spilled out, illuminating the ground beneath my feet. I hesitated, every fiber of my being telling me to walk away. But the night was cold, and curiosity is a dangerous thing. I stepped inside. The interior of the train was pristine. Velvet seats, brass fixtures, and an air of quiet luxury. It smelled faintly of lavender, though there was an underlying metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The passengers were seated in pairs, their faces turned toward the windows. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They didn't even acknowledge me as I walked down the aisle. "Welcome aboard." The voice made me jump. I turned to see a man standing at the far end of the car, dressed in a sharp black uniform. His cap obscured most of his face, but I could feel his gaze on me. Thanks," I said awkwardly. "Where does this train go?" He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Wherever you need to be." I frowned, but before I could ask another question, he gestured to an empty seat. "Please sit. The journey will begin shortly." I hesitated, glancing back at the passengers. Something about them felt off. Their hands rested limply on their laps, their heads tilted at strange angles. One of them, a woman in a pale dress, was staring directly at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. I quickly sat down. The train jolted forward, and the world outside the window became a blur of shadows and faint, flickering lights. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then, the conductor's voice echoed through the car. "Next stop, regret." I froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Next stop, regret. The conductor's voice had a cold, mechanical quality that echoed through the otherwise silent car. The passengers remained motionless, as if they hadn't heard a thing. I glanced at them again, trying to see any hint of recognition in their faces, but all I saw was emptiness. The train began to slow, and my heart began to pound. The window beside me shimmered, the outside world warping as though it were made of liquid glass. In the distance, I saw the faint outline of a desolate station. My palms were sweating. Regret? What did that even mean? My mind raced back to moments in my life I'd rather forget. Missed opportunities, unspoken words, things I'd done that could never be undone. The longer I stared out the window, the more I felt the pull of those memories, tugging at me like invisible hands. The train came to a sudden stop. The door slid open without a sound. "Here we are," the conductor said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Please, step off if you wish. We will not be staying long." I hesitated, but then something inside me urged me forward. I stood and walked to the door, my breath shallow as I stepped into the unknown. The platform was empty, desolate. A cold mist hung in the air, and there was a faint smell of decay, as if the station hadn't seen a soul in decades. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, like I was walking on a forgotten path through time. There was no sign of life, but I could feel the presence of something watching. I took a few tentative steps forward, my feet dragging through the thick fog. The air felt colder here, a biting chill that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in white clouds, mixing with the mist that surrounded me. Then, I saw it. A shadow stood just beyond the platform, partially hidden by the haze. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the figure moved, slowly, purposefully, toward me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, but the figure kept coming, its movement oddly graceful, like it was floating above the ground. It was tall, draped in a tattered cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. I stepped back, panic rising in my chest. "Stay away from me," I shouted. The figure didn't stop. It reached out toward me, its hand long and skeletal, fingers curled like claws. As it neared, the mist parted, and I saw the face, or what was left of it. Hollow, dark eyes. A mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide. Its skin was pale, stretched thin across its skull, the lips drawn tight in a grotesque smile. My heart raced. I turned and ran back toward the train, but the platform seemed to stretch farther away with every step I took. The train door was just ahead, but it felt unreachable. The figure was gaining on me, its silent footsteps echoing behind me. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I cried out. And then a voice, soft and mocking, answered from the darkness. "Because you called me here." I froze. My legs refused to move, as if the air around me had thickened into tar. The voice continued, low and threatening. "Your regret brought me. You can't run from what you've done." I spun around, but the figure was no longer there. The platform was empty, save for the mist swirling around my feet. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The voice answered again, but this time it seemed to come from everywhere. "To make sure you never forget." The ground beneath me trembled, and the station began to crack, as though the very earth itself was breaking apart. I stumbled back toward the train, my heart pounding in my chest. I made it to the door, but as soon as I stepped inside, the conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Next stop, Redemption." I collapsed into my seat, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. But as the train pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me inside, something that hadn't been there before. The train's steady rhythm became my only solace, the sound of the wheels on the track oddly comforting after the chaos of the platform. But even as the train moved forward, the weight in my chest remained. What had just happened? Was it real? And more importantly, what had I done to deserve it? The voice that had followed me, the entity from the platform, was still in my mind, its words echoing with every passing second. "You called me here." My breath hitched. My thoughts, like a storm, whirled around a singular memory, the one I had buried deep inside myself. The last time I'd felt that same cold presence had been a year ago. I shuddered, pushing the thought back, willing myself to forget. But there it was again. The voice, the shape. And as if on cue, the conductor's voice filled the car once more. "Next stop, Redemption." I turned to the windows, staring out at the passing darkness. The world beyond seemed to twist, the scenery bending as though reality itself was unraveling. And then, like a mirage, a new image appeared. A small town, lit only by a few scattered streetlights, the glow sickly green under a dull moon. It was an image I recognized all too well. Number not this. The train pulled in slowly, the lights from the station casting eerie shadows on the tracks. The door slid open and I stood, frozen. There was no mistaking it. The town, the street, the house. It was the place I had tried to forget. I stepped out of the train, my legs trembling beneath me. The air smelled like dust and mildew, but the familiar scent of regret filled my nostrils. It was too much to bear. This was where it had all begun. The choice I made. The one that had cost me everything. I glanced around, but the town was eerily silent. No people, no sounds. The streets were devoid of life, and the houses that lined them appeared abandoned. Windows were boarded up, doors left ajar, as though everyone had fled without a trace. And yet, I knew what awaited me. I walked toward my old house, each step heavier than the last. It loomed before me, the familiar porch lights flickering in the distance. The door creaked open as I approached, as if it were waiting for me. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the memories I had tried to bury. The furniture was exactly how I remembered it. The old sofa, the bookshelf lined with novels I had never read, the kitchen with its chipped tiles. But there was something wrong. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't the quiet of an abandoned home. It was the quiet of something watching. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room stood a figure, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible against the dim light. Slowly, it turned toward me. The figure's face was familiar. No, it couldn't be. But there it was, staring back at me. The hollow eyes, the twisted smile. The same figure from the station. It was wearing the same tattered cloak, and I could feel the coldness radiating off it. "Why are you here?" I choked out, barely able to breathe. The figure tilted its head, a mocking grin spreading across its face. "You never truly left, did you?" My heart raced. This isn't real." But the figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth. "It is as real as your actions. You can't escape the choices you've made." A memory flashed before me, a choice. A moment I couldn't undo. The figure's grin widened. "You wanted this. You summoned me when you couldn't face the consequences." I shook my head, backing away. I didn't mean to." "You can't escape," it interrupted, stepping closer still. "You've already crossed the point of no return." The walls of the house began to warp, the edges curling like paper left too long in the fire. The floor beneath me trembled, and I felt the very ground I stood on begin to pull away. I staggered back, my vision spinning. The house, the town, they were all falling apart, disintegrating into nothing. I reached for the door, but it slammed shut before I could touch it. I was trapped. The figure loomed closer, its voice a low, venomous whisper. "You can't run anymore." Then everything went dark. The train's steady rhythm snapped me back to reality. My body jerked in the seat, and I gasped for air. It was gone. The house. The figure. But the weight of my choices still clung to me, suffocating. I glanced around the car. The passengers were still silent, staring blankly ahead. The conductor stood at the far end, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. And then, the voice of the conductor came again, soft and unfeeling. "Next stop, the final reckoning." The train began to pick up speed again, the rhythmic churning of the wheels like a lullaby that tried to calm my racing thoughts. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the pit in my stomach that gnawed at me with every turn. Next stop, the final reckoning. I couldn't tell if I was ready for whatever awaited me. After everything, the mist, the figure, the house I couldn't leave behind, I had come to a realization. It wasn't just the train. It wasn't just the station or the strange passengers. This was my journey, my choices. Every stop, every memory had been a reflection of the things I'd tried to escape. The train's engine groaned and the world outside the window blurred. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the landscape change, an endless stretch of desolation, a sky thick with dark clouds. But before I could make sense of it, the scene outside flickered and was replaced by an image I never expected to see. It was my own reflection. I leaned forward, squinting at the window, as though trying to make sense of the distorted image staring back at me. I was sitting alone in the seat, yet the reflection showed me standing. I blinked. The reflection wasn't just distorted, it was wrong. The figure in the glass didn't have my face, but something close to it, a twisted mockery of my features. Its eyes were hollow, black voids. Its mouth was stretched in a grotesque smile. I gasped and spun around, but no one in the car moved. The passengers were still in their seats, their faces frozen in that eerie blankness. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Nothing. I turned back to the window. The reflection was still there, mocking me, growing clearer with each passing second. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. The conductor was standing beside me, silent. His cap shadowed his eyes, and his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. "Next stop, the final reckoning," he repeated, his voice hollow. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words had lost their meaning, replaced by the gnawing fear inside me. We were nearing the station, and as the train slowed to a crawl, the landscape outside became more twisted, more unreal. The sky turned a sickly green, the ground cracked open in places, and the world beyond seemed to bend in ways that defied reason. I didn't want to get off the train. Part of me wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The door slid open in front of me, and I hesitated. I had no choice. I stepped out into the mist. The station was different this time. It wasn't a place I recognized, but somehow it felt more familiar than anything I'd seen before. A vast, endless plain stretched out in front of me, bathed in an eerie, pale light that came from nowhere. There were no buildings, no walls, just emptiness. The horizon was a blur of gray and black, the air thick with an oppressive weight. And then I saw it. A figure was standing in the center of the plain, facing away from me. The tall, thin silhouette was unmistakable. The same twisted figure from before, the one I had seen in the house, on the platform. This time, it was waiting for me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The words came out raw, desperate. The figure didn't answer. It simply turned toward me, its face obscured by the darkness that seemed to cling to it. But I could feel its presence. The same cold, suffocating presence that had haunted me since I stepped onto this cursed train. It moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. "You are the one who called me," it said, its voice like a whisper in the wind. "You are the one who opened the door." I swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. I didn't want any of this. The figure tilted its head, its grin spreading impossibly wide. "That's the thing about choice. It doesn't care whether you want it or not. You called me when you couldn't live with what you'd done." I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Number, I didn't ask for this." The figure stepped forward, and the air grew colder with each movement. "But you did," it whispered, its voice growing louder with every step. "You summoned me with every decision you regret, with every path you didn't take." I closed my eyes, my hands trembling. "How do I end this?" I pleaded. "How do I stop this nightmare?" The figure stopped in front of me, its dark eyes boring into mine. "There is no ending," it said softly. "Only the reckoning." Suddenly, everything around me shifted. The mist thickened, and the ground beneath my feet began to crack open, swallowing everything in its path. The station, the train, the world, it all began to collapse, folding in on itself like a broken mirror. I reached out, but there was no one there to help. The figure, the passengers, the train, they were all fading, leaving me alone in the void. And then, just as I thought I might be swallowed whole, a new voice cut through the darkness. "This is not your end." I looked up, but there was nothing. No face, no figure, just the echo of those words resonating in the blackness. The world went silent. The darkness swallowed everything around me, yet I still stood there, suspended in time. My body felt like it was being torn apart, stretched and twisted in all directions. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. The words, the voice, had echoed in my mind, but I wasn't sure whether I had heard them aloud or if they had come from within. "This is not your end." The words floated in the air, thick with a weight I couldn't shake, but they offered no comfort. If anything, they only made the emptiness more unbearable. And then, the ground beneath my feet cracked open completely, and the darkness consumed me entirely. I had no sense of where I was or what was happening. It was like being in a vacuum, a place where time and space no longer existed. But then, the train reappeared. The familiar hum of the wheels, the faint flicker of dim lights in the distance, it was all there. The midnight train, the one I had boarded so many miles ago. But it was no longer just a train. It was a bridge between realities, a path through the fog of memory and regret. I stood there, unable to move, as the train's door opened once more. Next stop, the final reckoning. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice wasn't the conductor's, it was mine. My own voice, calling me forward. The guilt, the sorrow, the fear. They had all led me here, to this very moment. I had called this train. I had opened the door. The station was no longer an empty void. It had shape now, an abandoned platform, surrounded by twisted metal and glass. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. And there, standing at the edge of the platform, was the figure. It was no longer just a silhouette. It was me. But not me, not exactly. This figure, this shadow, had my face, my features, but it was twisted. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the air. Its skin was pale, almost lifeless, as if it had been drained of all color and vitality. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped toward me, each movement deliberate, its eyes never leaving mine. "You can't outrun yourself," it whispered, its voice almost a mockery of my own. I staggered back, shaking my head. "No, no, you're not me. You're not real." But the figure only smiled, its lips stretching impossibly wide, the darkness within its eyes deepening. "I am as real as your regrets, as real as your choices. You summoned me. You gave me life with every step you took." The figure moved closer still, and I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier. The world itself seemed to be pressing in, closing around me. There was nowhere to go, no escape. Why am I here?" I gasped, unable to take my eyes off it. The figure reached out a hand, and I couldn't stop myself from taking a step forward. I didn't want to touch it, but the pull was irresistible. The emptiness inside me felt like it was pulling me toward it, urging me to embrace whatever came next. "You're here because you never confronted the truth," the figure whispered, its voice a slithering sound. "You hid from the pain, from the choices that defined you. But now you must face it." Its hand brushed mine, and the moment our skin touched, I felt everything, the regret, the fear, the pain, slam into me. It wasn't just memories. It was every action, every wrong turn I'd taken, every life I had hurt, every path I had abandoned. And then, as if the weight of it all were too much to bear, I collapsed to my knees. The figure stood over me, its expression unreadable. "The reckoning doesn't come from others. It comes from within. You've always known it." I clenched my fists, trying to hold myself together. But the truth, the reality of it all, was suffocating. There was no more running, no more pretending that I could escape. The reckoning had always been here. It had always been me. And then a voice broke through the silence, a voice I'd almost forgotten. "You don't have to do this alone." I looked up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw another figure approaching. It was a woman, familiar, someone from a long-forgotten memory. She was walking toward me with a calm certainty, her eyes filled with compassion. "You've been lost," she said softly, kneeling beside me, "but you can find your way back." I reached out to her, my hand trembling. I don't know how," she smiled, her touch gentle against my skin. "You don't have to know everything. Just take the next step." The figure that had haunted me, my twisted reflection, began to fade, its presence shrinking with every breath I took. The darkness seemed to lift, and the air grew lighter, more breathable. "You can choose who you are," the woman said, her voice like a lullaby. "It's never too late." The mist that had surrounded the station began to dissipate, and I found myself standing on solid ground once more. The train was gone. The platform had vanished. Only the woman remained, and I realized that she was the key. The truth wasn't in the past. It wasn't in the train or the figure, or even in the reckoning. The truth was in me. And it was time I faced it. There are some things you can't outrun, some choices you can't undo. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the reckoning isn't about paying for what you've done. It's about realizing you can choose to be more than the sum of your past.